art versus your response to it, and then you can substitute art for anything. So like human behavior, world events, and then your response. Like those are two separate things. And I think in making reviews of books, that's the kind of separation that I formed. It's like there is this piece of art, and then there's my response to it, which are two different things. I challenge myself to review things and think, if I didn't like it, I will still finish the book and ask myself, why didn't I like it? And is it because it was bad or because I picked up the wrong book? Like, this wasn't meant for me. Right. You know, if I'm not interested at all in sci-fi and then I read a sci-fi book, like, it's not a bad book because it was about space. I had a bad reading experience because I'm not personally interested in that, you know?
This is just so fascinating to me because, again, and I'll include the majority of social media.
Yeah.
It's such a different experience to something like reading because you're just sort of consuming this thing that's coming at you. And I find that the amount of processing power it's less, you know, whereas reading a book, you have to activate your imagination. You have to visualize in many ways the things that you're reading. And so I think it's kind of incredible that you've been able to make these two really work.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that it's always so important to ask yourself why about anything. So why am I enjoying this? Why don't I like this? And that, having been doing that with reading books, has also bled into everything else that I do. Because now if I see a piece of content online, for example, that I don't like, I would be thinking in my head, what is it about this that I'm finding resistance to? And thinking about it as a personal response rather than a problem with the content or with the thing is so much more healthy. We briefly mentioned kind of online hate and criticism. I really do think it's been great for me as a human consuming content to always be thinking about, why am I responding in this way, rather than like, how can I make sure they know?
Right.
You know, and if something isn't serving you, you can unfollow, you can mute, you can, you know, stop consuming it. I think. But for me, it's always like thinking about, why am I responding in this way?
Do you ever read something and you're like, I don't even know how I feel about this?
Yeah.
And what do you do about that?
Then I sit down and I think, why am I confused? Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's always that extra thing of like, why do I feel that way? Was the book deliberately confusing? Did I just not grasp it? Did, you know, anything like that?
Do you have methods for piecing this together? Like, do you go about decoding this through conversation, or like, do you write it out?
I think writing out like a review, writing out thoughts is useful, and having kind of prompts.
I'm just going to keep drilling down on this because this is fascinating.
Keep going.
When you write a review, where do you begin? What does that process look like?
Okay, so specifically on books, but I guess you can apply this to a lot of art forms. Like, I think of things like tone, mood, perspective, characters and setting, but also intention. So like, what was I meant to get out of this? For example, there are books about awful things like cannibalism and incest. Like, they're disgusting, and the books are disgusting, but they're meant to be. Like, you could review one of those books and say, I hated this book, it was about cannibalism, that's horrid, that's deplorable and deranged and gross. Obviously it is. So the author knows that. So then I think you then need to break it down. Okay, is the author promoting that, or is the author, and the answer is probably no, I would assume.
Well, maybe they're trying to make a point, right?
Maybe they are.
Like, do you go online and try to get a better grasp of the context sometimes to figure that out? Yeah,
for sure. I think sometimes you need to read like the author's note, or listen to an interview where the author explains, and then you get a better grasp of things, for sure. The other thing I think you get from reading is empathy. And I think that's probably the most important one for me, is that you get to firstly understand perspectives and experiences that you've never had, but secondly, appreciate that everyone is having perspectives and experiences that you've never had. And if any of us wrote a book, they would be about completely different things, naturally, because we all perceive the world in a slightly different way. And, you know, thinking about people and characters as like complicated, flawed things is quite useful to be like, no one is perfect, and we're all just doing this for the first time. This is our first attempt at living. So we're just doing our best.
This reminds me of a conversation we had about like Haruki Murakami's his portrayal of women.
Yeah,
Right. Like that's
super
very
problematic.
common. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, problematic, or do you feel? I mean, like, do you feel that there's any degree of intentionality to it, where he's showing like a male perspective,
So this is what I've
which
always
can
thought.
be two-dimensional?
Yeah, this is what I'd always thought when I read Murakami books, and they would speak about women in a way that was it would kind of objectify. We talk about them like they were just tits on legs, right?
Right, basically.
It's crazy. And I thought, okay, he's writing from the perspective of like this 19-year-old uni student who's been super sheltered. Maybe that is how that person sees them. And yeah, if you're writing from a character's perspective, we can't be like, that is wrong, because some people do think like that. And then as the reader, again, you have that separate, you're meant to be thinking, should we think like that? The answer is probably no.
Right.
Well, it is no. However, with Murakami, I then saw this interview where a female Japanese author, Miyako Kawakami, interviewed him, and she kind of called him out on this, and she kind of said, like, is it intentional? Are you trying to get into the headspace of these characters? And he was like, no.
What?
And I was like,
Oh, bummer.
oh, really? And
But
it
then
kind of did change my perspective on him a little bit.
That's super interesting though too, because like, how old is he at this point?
Oh, I've got no idea.
He's an older guy, right?
Older.
So, at that point, for me, as I'm trying to gather context, I take into consideration where the author's
Who
from,
the author is.
who the author is, and I think that also affects my takeaways from the book, because it's almost like now you're getting an insight on a different generation, right? Yeah. Not to be like, okay, this should be how it is, but
yeah. No, but it's interesting to hear perspectives that aren't the same as yours, right? And that is probably one of them. So there's value in that.